First, we'll look at establishing a documentation space to support your product, a kind of documentation 101. We'll cover building out content so that people who use your products can find the content they need easily and quickly. In this section, we'll look at creating a space and setting up a navigation structure. Confluence is often used for documentation for products, for processes, for system setup, and so on. However, if you allow your content to grow organically and don't plan for growth or think about structure ahead of time, the content will become difficult to use or retrieve and will, of course, become less useful. We'll look at how we can best present and organize content in Confluence so that it's easy to find and use. We'll start by considering what a good documentation space is. Let's look at that now. A good documentation space should be easy to use. People should be able to find the content they need, and it should be easily found through search. The content should be well presented and use a consistent and non-confusing design layout. You should also make sure that the content fully meets the needs of the end user. Always keep the audience in mind. And of course, it must be well maintained. This means scrutinizing old pages for relevance, updating old content, and ensuring pages are not scroll-intensive, confusing, or difficult to understand. To create your documentation space, you should begin by thinking about the purpose of the space. Is the documentation for something technical or for an employee handbook? Consider the audience before you start. And then think about the content. How are you going to manage that? Do you need to create a new space, or should you add a new space structure? The answer is, of course, it depends. And we'll look into the considerations here in this segment. The content that goes into the space must be controlled and managed, and you must take care with how it's added. Plan to avoid having a page hierarchy of more than 4 levels deep. Don't make consumers of your content have to dig to find content. Also consider the things you need to do and plan for in order to make your documentation easy to update and maintain. We'll look at all of these points in more detail in the next slides. In Confluence, you should aim to avoid creating more spaces than necessary. If everyone has the permission to create a space and nothing is managed, the danger is that spaces will be created in a very ad hoc manner, and a proliferation of spaces can result in content being unmanaged. Also, what happens often is that users will create a space that covers content that is also covered in one or several other existing spaces, causing a great deal of confusion. That said, it is often necessary to create a new space. We'll look at when it would make sense to do so and when it might make sense to use an existing space. If you're creating an employee handbook, you'll probably want to include it in the relevant company space. There would be no need to create a separate space with the same team accessing it, same permissions, using the design, and so on. But if the documentation is for a specific product, you'll probably need to create a new space to manage it. If you want to limit access to a specific group of users, you might need a new space. You might also need a new space if the content is to be externally accessible, to separate it from content that might be sensitive. We'll look a little into spaces and space settings next. First, let's look at how to create spaces and the permissions needed for that. In order to create a space, you'll need the global permission. Here we see the global permissions that are accessed via Confluence administration. You'll see that members of the Confluence administrators group can create spaces, and in this instance, all members of the Confluence users group can too. You might want to constrain space creators to a more limited group of users. Take care when allowing people the ability to create spaces. If you have a large Confluence instance, then if everyone can create spaces in Confluence, it's likely that content will get difficult to manage. Without careful management, space content will be replicated and people will not be sure if content should go into, for example, the training space, the training team space, or the training product space. We also want to be careful of creating structures that are too complex. The general guideline is to keep pages no more than 4 to 5 layers deep. Content buried 20 levels deep will be difficult to find for end users. while also making life difficult for those who are managing the content. Now, let's take a look at our first demo covering the structuring of content in an existing space.
Hi, my name is Leslie Valentine, and I'll be walking you through the demonstrations for this course. In this demonstration, we'll be looking at ways that we improve documentation content using some of Confluence's key features. Here we have an example of documentation that grew organically over time. Here in this tab you can see that it's difficult for the consumer to know where to start to look for content that might be useful to them. In this tab we have the same content that has been created with the considerations we have just been talking about in the presentation. In this older version, it is difficult to find relevant content from the home page. The home page should be a jumping off point so that consumers can get to the documentation that they need quickly. Here, there is no useful landing page. Here, in the updated content, we did a few things before we started. We looked at Google Analytics to find the most frequently accessed content and made sure that it was easy to find. Since this is documentation for a Confluence app, it came as no surprise that the most frequently accessed content was the app's macros. Consumers here look for instructions on the basic usage of the product. What we did was add a label of Springboard to those frequently accessed pages. If you look over here at the top right, there are links that automatically created using the content label macro, surfacing links to the content pages labeled Springboard. The other area we've surfaced on the right-hand side panel is useful links, again added by using the content by label macro. We can now easily add links to this section by labeling them useful. Next, we looked at the documentation and thought about the different kinds of users that would access the content. We decided to help consumers find their content by grouping according to user type. We have authors, end users, administrators and developers using the product. So we decided to provide links to the navigation according to user type. We created these images and we've linked them through to the main sections of the documentation. Now, administrators, for example, can come to the landing page of the documentation and easily find the content that's relevant to them. This navigation is replicated on the left-hand sidebar navigation. If we look at these images, they're clicked through to the relevant content. And that concludes this demonstration, where we looked at ways that you can improve documentation content to make it easier to consume.
Now we'll look at another important consideration: audience. It will define your content. Is the documentation for a technical audience, or is your space set up as an employee guide? In either case, you don't want people to have to search for a long time to find the answers they need. You want content that's easy to search, navigate, and then consume. End-user content will be different from content that will be useful for technical administrators. And of course, if it's technical content, that's going to be very different to content delivered for people accessing an employee guide for the marketing team. The ultimate goal, of course, is to make content easy to find and use. You can do that in a number of ways. One way is by reducing the amount of content in a page. Less is definitely more when it comes to content in a knowledge base. We'll look at this in the upcoming demonstration. Another thing you can do is move information in spaces up to the first hierarchy level. Let's look at some examples to demonstrate this. Here's a great example of how you can improve your approach to content and make your documentation easier to manage. We have some Confluence documentation at version 4.2. Look at how much scrolling the consumer has to do. There's a lot of content here, and it's presented in quite an overwhelming way. Take a look at the left menu. Today's consumers do not want reams of content to read through. In the more recent Confluence content, there's a real move to support people for whom TLDR, or too long didn't read, is a challenge. In the more recent content, that has changed. Here is version 6.8. As you can see, the new navigation has been reduced. It's easy to read through. You don't see lots of links that can be distracting. Consumers can easily jump to useful page content from a right-hand menu and also jump to other pages containing related content. We'll look at managing pages and spaces in the next segment. This segment was a Documentation 101. We looked at some of the basics around making documentation content easy to consume. We've covered creating spaces or reusing spaces, setting up easy-to-use navigation, and the important considerations of audience when presenting your content.